Hey everybody, I'm Sasha.
And I'm Nesim Vatani, and this is The Underground.
So today is episode number 2, and we're going to be talking about the recent events in Israel and Palestine. But first, we just want to update you on where we've been. As you can see, if you are watching this video, we have created a new channel just for The Underground. We want to be able to explore our ideas in a different venue. I know that a lot of my viewers on the Plebity channel might not be interested in some of these topics. So we're now located here on this channel, The Underground.
Yeah, and to add on to that, there's a little change in my name and whatnot. So essentially, I'm going under a different name now, my real name, because it suits. If I'm going to be in the public, might as well have everyone know who I am.
So, with those updates out of the way, let's get into the episode. Today's episode is about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we're going to start by talking about some of the history of the city of Jerusalem and why it's been such a contested place right up until the recent event with Trump recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and kind of how that comes into play with the current situation. And then we're going to get into what's been happening in the past couple of weeks in Gaza in particular and talk about some of the context and our thoughts on this region.
Yeah, since Trump decided to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and decided that we would no longer be following the UN Declaration that Jerusalem is a divided city, one half being for the Palestinians, the other half being for the Jewish people. They decided, and there's issues with Jerusalem in and of itself, because it's kind of like the way the wording was, it was heavily expected that Jerusalem would be the capital for the Palestinians. And Israel, that's a no-go. They want it all. So by moving
What was the wording? What are you referring to with that?
The UN Declaration on Jerusalem. Let me get that out for you. Let's see. The Palestinians have the right of their own state, 1967, with East Jerusalem as their capital. Okay, so this was originally it was the Turks and a bunch of the Arab states that had fought for Jerusalem to be a part of the 1967 partition, the 1967 borders of what was supposed to be the Palestinian state. That would make up East Jerusalem, and that was the kind of the concession. East Jerusalem would be Palestinian, then the other half could be Israeli. December 6, 2017, United States recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And on the 2018, May 14th, 2018, United States moved its embassy to Tel Aviv, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In the partition plan, as a part of it was supposed to be a part of partition plan of Palestine, included the establishment of Jerusalem as a separate international entity under the auspices of the United Nations. That was the original plan. Okay, 1947. From there, that became a debate between the two. Mm-hmm. Who is supposed to be, because after the war in 1948, the Israelis captured one side, the Jordanians had the other. So Israel had West Jerusalem, Jordan had East Jerusalem. And then the 6-day war, East Jerusalem was captured by the Israelis. And from then on, East Jerusalem was not annexed into Israel. And the negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis was that the Palestinians wanted Jerusalem a part of the West Bank, and the Palestinian argument was, you have Tel Aviv. The UN argument was that neither should have the city, and that it should be a independent entity. Okay. Now, the whole situation has basically been decided when the United States said, no, Israel has it. The United States is basically, no matter what, the U.S. is basically the world's hegemon. So originally, Jerusalem was to be a independent city, but with the 1948 war, the city being partitioned between Jordan and Israel, and then the 1967 war with Israel taking both, East Jerusalem was an occupied city. That was its standing. It was occupied by the Israelis. It was not a part of Israel proper. And there's a reason for this. To be blunt, Israel does not want to give the Palestinians that live there Israeli citizenship. So they ever since then they have been, well, even before the giving of East Jerusalem to Israel by the United States, there had been evictions. There's always been this culture in East Jerusalem of Palestinians not leaving their homes, because they know the minute they leave their homes, they come back, someone else is living there. So they'll stay there. And
someone else being probably an Israeli settler, right?
Yes. The way it works in Israel is that Israeli Palestinians, meaning Israeli citizens, because they're not Jewish, they do not have the same rights as that of Israeli Jews. They are not allowed to own, like cities and towns in Israel can say to Israeli Arabs, you're not allowed to buy land here. That is a fact. The Israeli government does not invest heavily in Israeli Arab land. So Israeli schooling, like when you look at it, the Arabs live only in certain areas like Haifa, Lod, and all that. There are all these other places that they are not allowed to own land in at all. And there even it kind of, in a way, Israel is a lot like a secularized version of Saudi Arabia, because especially when you go into the West Bank, because there are Jewish only roads. Like only Jews can use, no Arabs can use. And
I mean, this is part of the reason why it's called an apartheid state, right?
Yes, this
or
is why
they're imposing apartheid.
I think apartheid is kind of wrong in my opinion, because in the case of apartheid South Africa, the white populace wanted the black populace. They wanted the workers. Okay, they wanted them as workers and whatnot. They just didn't want them as citizens. It's like, all right, we'll give you Bantustans. There you go. In Israel, it's a much different thing. Israel has no care, no want for the Palestinians in the land. They want the land. They don't want the people. And this can really be seen in East Jerusalem with what had been happening in May and whatnot. Usually what the Israelis would do is they would have the security forces come. They would serve you the warrant telling you that you're going to have to go to the courts and you're looking at an eviction notice, and they would battle out in the court, and the court would always do the same thing. They would not recognize the land deeds of the Palestinians. They would declare them void and say, well, at one point a Jewish person may have lived here, so that's enough to take that away. But what changed is in May, the Israelis started to allow the settlers to go in house by house, neighborhood by neighborhood, and force those people out with the help of the security forces. I mean, you just get a guy, a bunch of men come into your home with guns saying, get out of your home. You're getting out and leaving now. And that was what they were doing. They were going from neighborhood to neighborhood. There's a video on my Twitter of a settler, a Frenchman, who is talking about, with his French accent, about how they're going and removing these people, house by house, neighborhood by neighborhood, and saying, well, yeah, it's at their expense, but this whole country was built at the expense of these people. It's our land. We'll take it from them. This is how it's going to go. And it started intensifying so much that at a certain point, this was before the rockets start firing, the settlers were intensifying the taking of the evictions. Well, I would always say evictions, because evictions mean that it's like throwing out tenants. This is just stealing of people's homes. I mean, to take it like this, if Mexico if they took Texas, and then the Mexican military and Mexican men were roaming around kicking people out of their homes, saying, well, this used to be Mexico's land. So you people living here, you Americans, you don't have rights because we say you don't. And we're doing this. We'd say that's people stealing. And that's what they're doing. They're stealing these people's homes. Okay. They're stealing everything.
And then how did that start to escalate?
Well, what happened is the Palestinians began to protest. The Palestinians in East Jerusalem began protesting, which then the protests began getting violent, because the settlers are allowed to use violence, and the settlers want them gone. So then there starts to become these fighting between the two sides. Then the Israeli security forces get involved. Then the lynchings begin. So you have these settler mobs running around, breaking into people's homes and killing people. Just outright. There are videos of it on Twitter. You can find it. You've got these horrible things, like this one video of you see the man lying on the ground while the security forces are pushing their way through the apartment complex. Because what had happened is the settlers had ran in, lynched the guy, and the family of this guy were sitting there waiting for these people to move out so they could go to him. And what do they find? You hear the cries of this little girl screaming for her father to come to her, but he doesn't move. When they sit there and they put him onto his back, you can see his eyes are still open. They choked him to death.
Do you know where that was?
I don't know what city that was. I think that might have been in Haifa. All these people who talk about this is all for Israeli security, the Israeli military is so stretched thin by the occupation that they're using these settlers as a form of paramilitary. So they don't have to deploy the Israeli military into the cities.
Okay, and when we're saying I'm looking at Plus 97.2 magazine, and they say in Jerusalem, the anger exploded on May 10th when Israel's Supreme Court was set to issue a verdict on the imminent expulsion of several Palestinian families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah in order to move Jewish settlers into the area. The decision was ultimately postponed. And then it says the same day, Israeli police stormed into Al-Aqsa Mosque and fired rubber-coated bullets, tear gas, and stun grenades at worshippers.
Yes.
Wounding hundreds of Palestinians.
Yes. So what happened, so the protests and whatnot started intensifying. And so there's some ugly things like a lot of people think that the Palestinian conflict is a Muslim versus Jewish thing. It's not. Palestinians are also Christians. And so what they were doing to the Palestinian Christians and Muslims were they were blocking off the churches and the mosques. So they wouldn't let Palestinian Christians go to the churches. They wouldn't let the Palestinian Muslims into Al-Aqsa. And then the settlers, who are pretty brazen, they admit their whole want is to get rid of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So what they did was they tried to storm with 30,000 people. They tried to storm the mosque. This meant that more Palestinians started going to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so what happened is that the Israelis decided clear them out. And that's what they did. There's videos of that, like where here you have women praying and the security forces are throwing flashbangs and tear gas at them. And they're running out of the building, trying to get out as fast as possible. I mean, the whole thing starts spiraling out of control. And as it got more and more violent, then the rockets began. Hamas got involved because, it's Ramadan. Because of the Abraham Accords, the Israelis believe that they could do anything they want and no one's watching, so
What is
they'll
the
do
Abraham
whatever they want.
Accords?
The Abraham Accords are these it made official what was always unofficial. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and a few other like Sudan and whatnot opened into basically a peace accords with Israel, which basically got Saudi Arabia and UAE out of the conflict. Basically, now it's like they're officially at peace with one another, but really they always were. Just something to say. Israel, since the 1967 war, was the greatest friend to the UAE, to not UAE, but to the Arab monarchies there ever could be. The 67 war destroyed the pan-Arab movement that would have wiped out all these monarchies, because it humiliated Gamal Nasser. He was the leader of the pan-Arab movement. And
so why do you say Israel was a friend to them?
Because this is history, a little bit of history.
Yeah, we'll go into that a bit, and then we'll come back to present.
Okay, so with people don't understand that during the 50s and 60s, most of the Arab states had no legitimacy, because when Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, none of these countries, Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, none of them ever existed. They were provinces that were a part of the Ottoman Empire. Like Arabia existed as a land, but it was never a nation. When the British decided to leave, they created, with the Sykes-Picot Accord, they created Syria, they created Iraq. Like Iraq is a country which no Arab can tell you where the name Iraq comes from. It's not a name that the Arabs gave to the country. They don't know why the British decided that name, and no historian knows where that name came from. It was like, this country, it's going to be made of 3 provinces, a partial province, because Kuwait was made from Basra province, but we're going to call it Iraq, and there you go. So these nations had a legitimacy problem, because all these Arabs found themselves being ruled by a bunch of tribes who called themselves kings. The Saudi family, for example, the Saudi family, they were just a tribe, the tribe of Saud. They were given their kingdom. Same with the Khalifa family, same with the Vatani family, all of them. They were the people that were willing to work with the British and French. And so they were given their kingdoms. And what happened is an argument that was back in 1910 made by the Coptic Christian Arabs argued for a pan-Arab state. When Gamal Nasser came about, he agreed with that. That's why if you look at the flags of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, and it's not Lebanon. I'm going to say those because those are the ones I can remember off the top of my head. All of them have the same flag: red, white, and black. With all the bars correspond. The only difference is the emblems. What that was supposed to represent was the goal of those nations to become one nation, and each one of them would be basically states, because they wanted basically their own version of the United States. With Iraq, Prince Faisal got overthrown by General Qasem. With Syria, same thing. The prince got overthrown. The Assad family came up. You had these monarchies getting thrown down, and these basically socialist countries rise up in their place. That's also another problem. The Arabs more so went for a form of socialism over capitalism. But anyway, this is just building up to it. But anyway, when you look at what Israel did, was Gamal Nasser and the Pan-Arab movement was so strong that it could be seen that most Arabs saw him as the leader of Arabs. Like when he went to Saudi Arabia, the people were heralding him like a king. The king of Saudi Arabia at the time was literally humiliated by him. And it didn't help that the Arabs referred to all these countries, sans Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, as joke states. That's literally what they referred them to, joke states. None of them have any legitimacy. Well, come the 67 war, Gamal Nasser's humiliated. Egypt is crushed. Syria, crushed. Lebanon, crushed. The Israelis beat them all down. It is a humiliating loss. And so it killed the Pan-Arab state, especially after Gamal Nasser had his heart attack and died. That killed everything. And from there, Israel became like the apple of America's eye, because it showed that it had done something that the Americans were trying to figure out what they wanted to do with that region, which is in 1958, Eisenhower was concerned about what he called a campaign of hatred by the Muslim Arabs in the Middle East, and they were wondering, why is it that the Arabs do not like the United States? And the commission came back to him with the following. Well, the view that the Arabs have of the United States is the United States supports dictators. It supports all these people who want to block development of their nation, and wants to seize their oil and wants to use that oil for their use, not for the country's use. And he said this viewpoint is hard to counter because we are doing this and we should continue doing this. So the problem they faced was, how do we deal with this issue of anti-American thought and also with the Pan-Arab movement? Israel became the solution. It beat down those states, basically kicked them all in the teeth, and broke whatever social cohesion, because now everyone knew that none of these states could stand up to Israel. Israel was the major power of the region. And by doing this, Gamal Nasser's done. Now they have no real hope of getting that Pan-Arab country they're looking for. They have the monarchies, and that's all they have. So that's why Israel became the apple of America's eye. Because prior to that, the invasion of the Suez Canal, Israel was not. America had sent to Israel, you need to leave, and we'll deal with the French and British, which they did. They went to the UN, they destroyed Britain economically. They made the pound sterling crash. And the British, when they were trying to flee Egypt, were actually having their troops getting shot at and killed by UN forces under direction of America. So that's a little history for everyone to know. So this is why Israel and Saudi Arabia and the GC countries have always been talking under the radar, because while the populations are disdainful of Israel, the monarchs really require them. Because one, it takes some of the pressure off of them. All they need to do is sit there and say, yes, these people are horrible, they're so bad, we can unite against them. And when they're really not, it also means that the other states, for them, they know if they press too far and push against Saudi Arabia or whatnot, that America doesn't have to invade, Israel will deal with them. And that was the thought pattern up until the first Gulf War. Because
so do you think this is the origins of why the US supplies so much arms to Israel?
Yes, that is the origin. The origin, 1967 war is the origin of it. Because it like they refer to it as America's, Israel was referred to as America's unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Middle East. And you even have Biden back in the 80s saying that if Israel did not exist, that we would have to make Israel. So it was an admission, because the jewel of America's empire is Saudi Arabia. No one knows that, though. Everyone thinks that Saudi Arabia is like just some kingdom that we support, but in reality, they're the linchpin of American power, because Saudi Arabia is the head of OPEC, and Saudi Arabia is the one that has ensured that the American dollar is needed to be used to purchase oil. So that's what makes what's called the petrodollar. America being a fiat currency and having no fear of the balance of payment allows them to basically become the financier for everyone. Everyone has to go through America to buy oil from an OPEC nation. They have to use American dollars, so they have to finance. So two nations that have no interest in dealing with the United States at all have to go to the United States to finance just to buy oil, because that one nation that is an OPEC member has to require payment for its oil in dollars. So that country has to come to the United States, make an account, buy bonds and do all this stuff, get the dollars, and then because the balance of payment, America's not promising you gold. That oil country, then, if you watch how they spend, they then take that money and spend it back into America by buying arms and crappy weapons.
So it's interesting because you give all this history, and to make it clear, I think that this is about empire and these other countries. Whereas people do think of it, as you started your explanation, they think of it as Jews versus Arabs. And they think of it as in this very localized, isolated way. And while all this is happening, I mean, you have, from the Jewish perspective, you've had World War II.
Yes.
Europe has completely kicked out the Jews who haven't been slaughtered. And for hundreds of years before the Holocaust happened, Jews were persecuted in, many parts of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
They were only allowed to live in certain areas, and they were subject to pogroms and other forms of oppression. So for the Jews, this was their one refuge. This was the only place on earth. I mean, where could they go? There were quotas for them to come here. A lot of Jews did come to the U.S. after World War II, and many of them went to Israel.
Yeah.
So then we have the creation of this. Well, I mean, it wasn't the beginning of Zionism. Obviously, Zionism existed long before that. But we have the creation of this really intense identity-based country. I mean, obviously. So now, I mean, without completely going into all of the history, because we would have to do many episodes for that, bring us up to today. I mean, May. So in May, we had these violent evictions, settlers roaming around like lynch mobs and attacking Palestinians. And then there was the mosque protests and attacks on the protesters. And then now Hamas in Gaza starts firing rockets.
Yeah, see, here's the problem. Israel has a demographics issue. And if it is to be a Jewish state, it can't have a minority that can be the majority one day. Israel's very committed to keeping its demographics. So it has to eject these people out of its territories and either throw them into the West Bank or just get rid of them, because, well, again, their demographics issue. They don't want the two-state solution. Israel is not interested in the two-state solution. Even though it may play to that, the Likud party, which rules, it campaigns on the argument of no two-state solution. They will never let it happen. That's why you have the settlements. They're there to make sure the two-state solution will never happen. Well, what happens in that case? Well, expulsions. So they're expelling, and then Hamas.
So basically, to finish explaining the population issue, I mean, I'm not sure people might not fully understand that. So in order for it to be a Jewish state, they do have, they do have democratic elections. So if there were more Arabs than Jews, these elections wouldn't go the same way.
Yeah, it wouldn't go the same way. And also, the Likud passed, I think it was the nation state law, which said that Israel is a country for Jewish people and Jewish people only.
Mm-hmm.
So it has
and is this Netanyahu's party?
Yes.
So very far right, very militaristic, nationalistic, racist, you could say. Yes. Norman Finkelstein says Jewish supremacist, actually. That's what he called Netanyahu.
Yes. And the Likud, as far right as they are, there are parties that they're in alliance with that are far worse. You can go look up Ayelet Shaked, for example, or Naftali Bennett. Both of them outright state that there should be ethnic cleansing of the entire occupied territories and Gaza. Ayelet Shaked was the one who said that that Palestinian mothers should be killed, that they should start targeting them. So, and she also had a pro-fascism was an ad where she's saying that fascism isn't a bad thing. So take that as what you will. And she was the former justice minister. So anyway, the Hamas starts firing rockets into Israel. And there is a difference between the rockets of this year and the rockets that were shot out during Operation Protective Edge and Operation Cast Lead. Operation Cast Lead, the rockets were, and Operation Protective Edge, 2008 for Cast Lead, 2014 for Protective Edge. The Palestinians were basically using modified fireworks, and Iron Dome was just doing, wonders against that. Well, in this time, it's much different. The Palestinians, the Hamas had rockets that actually worked, are rockets, and they were firing them out.
And we saw some Israeli deaths, right? I'm not sure the number, but people did die.
Yeah,
including children.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And these rockets were basically fired in mass and were overwhelming the Iron Dome defense system. So this changes the tempo of things. Israel is used to the idea that the Palestinians are going to fire something at them, but their shelters and the Iron Dome, if there is a death, it might be one or two, and that's about it. This time, unfortunately, there was a bit more. Now, the response is typical, okay? It probably would have been far worse had like Obama been in power. It seems that Biden actually could be pressured into getting the Israelis to stop. But with the Israelis, with their bombardment, they were going hard this time. I mean, normally they would bomb schools, they bomb water treatment plants. That's their MO. They do commit massive amounts of war crimes because people don't understand Gaza. People sit there and say Hamas hides behind its people and all that, but they don't understand what Gaza is. Gaza is the most population dense region of the world because it's literally a city and a few villages on top of each other. Yeah, 2 million people in a strip that's 24 miles long and 7 miles wide.
Mm-hmm. So, and half of them are minors, I believe.
Yeah, 40% of the 40% of Gaza is children. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at a huge amount of the populace is under 18, and the rest of it is, what you have, adults and whatnot. But
and it's been described as an open air prison because
yes,
you cannot leave. I mean, Israel completely blocks any way out. There's these checkpoints, but they're armed and guarding all the borders. You can't leave even to go into Egypt. That's blocked. You
yeah,
can't leave by the sea. That's blocked.
yeah.
So
What
everything
Israel,
is controlled, and Israel controls what goes in. So they limit the amount of food, they count the calories so
yeah,
that it's the minimum that people need to survive based on, nutritional guidelines of what people need the bare minimum to live.
yeah. And people have this idea that like Hamas controls the area. As you said, all Israel did when they stopped occupying Gaza was they just took the IDF and took them from the territory to the border. So it went from open occupation to basically like a siege.
Okay. When did that happen? When did that change happen?
They withdrew from the Gaza Strip in summer of 2005. So what you're looking at is from 2005 to now, because Hamas came to power in 2007.
And
So
they were elected.
Yeah, they were elected, and from 2007 onward, they've been under siege ever since then. Like the blockade, when Hamas came into power, the blockade went up. Like beforehand, they were just positioned on the outside. Now they did the full blockade. Even the seas. The Palestinians cannot go too far from the shore. They're just not allowed. And for Gaza, much of its industry was fishing. That's why, like the keffiyehs that they wear, that white and black keffiyeh. Well, some people look at it as rags that they wear. The pattern of that is to be a fish net to represent that fishing is the main source. The bars of their keffiyehs is the trade, and under that there's these like leaf-like what is it, symbols. That's to represent the orchards and stuff that Palestine lives off of, and that's symbolic of Gaza because the orchards that they have were uprooted by the Israelis. The fishing is completely denied to them, and the water treatment plants are so bad. Well, there's so much damage that the raw sewage is just pumped into the Gazan Sea. So I mean, it's just like Anna Parampil, when she was in RT, she actually went there. They were filming it, where it was this open, it was a basically destroyed pipe that was just pumping out raw sewage into the water. And I mean, because they couldn't clean, none of the plants were really working. Like Gaza does not, only 3% of the water in Gaza is drinkable. So I mean, like most of the population is on bottled water. So
yeah,
it's extreme.
Yeah. So okay, Hamas is firing these more real rockets than usual. Israel is responding with disproportionate force as they've done in the past, and they're bombing Gaza.
Yeah. Now what they do is they rely on the argument of saying, well, Hamas is there. Well, one, they weren't able to get at any of the rockets because those are mobile. Two, Israel's not too confident that the IDF can unleash casualties with ground forces, keep the casualties on their side low, and get the casualties for Hamas as high as possible, because they know one of the things that Palestine creates in spades is engineers. Palestinians have some of the highest amount of engineers civil engineers in the world. So you have a lot of people that understand how to build tunnels, how to build, infrastructure. And so Hamas is buried deep. So the IDF knows it's going to be in a fight, and they've had issues with, having soldiers get killed. And the worst thing in Israel, soldiers getting captured by Hamas is the biggest humiliation for the IDF. They would rather the soldier be shot dead than them to be captured. It's a national humiliation when it happens. So they don't want to risk that, because Netanyahu is also embroiled in all these little, it's not little, it's actually big. He's embroiled in the corruption scandal. So he doesn't.
He's been in power for what, more than 10 years?
Yeah, and that's actually not supposed to happen. Under Israeli law, the prime minister has a set amount of terms, but he gets around this by doing snap elections. He creates a crisis, uses it to declare snap elections, and wins it, and stays in power. He's brilliant on that matter. I mean, you're looking at a man who's been able to stay in power longer than anyone else and just use the system to his advantage. It is something. I mean, Israel doesn't have, if I remember correctly, they don't have a written constitution. Okay, they're kind of like America and a few other nations have written constitutions. Israel's kind of like, I think, like Britain. They don't have a constitution. They're really just ruled by fiat by the government. They have a Supreme Court, but all that stuff is always in flux. And that's why you have the issue with who is and who isn't a Jew. There's been the fights in Israel about saying that any Jewish person who doesn't live in Israel should be declared non-Jews. So that's been fought for by the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish camp. But
because Israel has really gone too far to the right wing, right? Like, I wonder about, the average Israeli citizen. I mean, what do they think of their government, and what do they think is going on right now? They can't all be so super nationalist and believe in this bombardment of Gaza.
Well, I mean, 48% of Israelis have said they're fine with ethnic cleansing of the state.
In those words?
Yes, actually worse. So we'll keep it to ethnic cleansing.
I'd like to know, what did it say?
They were saying that whether genocide or ethnic cleansing, they'd be fine with.
Where can I find that?
Let me get that.
And, obviously there's a lot of discussion about anti-Semitism, and if you criticize Israel, you will get accused of anti-Semitism. You'll get accused of, I've been accused, now that I've spoken about Israel, of spreading anti-Semitism. And I think that it's the ultimate identity politics, that because you're in this group that has real historical oppression and victimization, that now as a victim, we can't criticize you, we can't hold you up to the same standards as everybody else. That in itself is offensive and anti-Semitic to me, to say that Jews are somehow different than other people, or should be held to a different standard, or be allowed a different set of rules.
What amazes me is that it's treating Jews as a monolithic block.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's saying that all Jews are aligned with Israel, and if they're not, then they're anti-Semitic themselves. They're self-hating Jews, and that's a weird thing. That would be like sitting there saying that I'm anti-Arab because I don't like Saudi Arabia. Can I criticize Saudi Arabia and not be, considered anti-Arab?
So. Yeah.
Like, I understand there are anti-Semites who criticize Israel, who are pro-Palestinian. And when those people rear their heads, they should be shouted down. Like unfortunately, there was a bunch of moronic thugs who ran around attacking Jewish people, sitting there saying any Jew needs dead. Like, there was a video of pro-Palestinian I think this was in London, so they're talking about raping Jewish daughters.
Mhm.
It's like, those people, they're disgusting. Those people should be like, they should be imprisoned for that. Like they should be either fined or in jail for that. Because that's not something that you do. Okay.
And we
You can,
saw some beatings in Los Angeles, New York,
yeah,
Toronto. There were people beating Jews, going around and looking for Jews and beating them.
yeah. So there is an issue with anti-Semitism. We can't deny that. With the Toronto one, though, it was a little bit different because CBC did an apology. It was a fight between a group of JDL and a group of Palestinian activists.
Okay. So
The
by the way,
JDL
yeah, go ahead.
JDL is recognized by America as a terrorist organization. There's a video of one of the guys in a blue and white short, and he had a knife.
Okay, so
And
that
he
one
was-
maybe was not what I thought. I don't know the story, but certainly this was happening. And now the link you sent me, you sent me something behind a paywall, so I can't read it all.
Oh,
But
I'm sorry.
It's the Independent, and they say almost half of Jewish Israelis believe Arabs should be, quote, expelled or transferred from Israel, a survey has found.
Yeah.
So, and then it says a study carried out by the Pew Research Center found that around 1 in 5 adults questioned strongly agreed with the controversial statement, which amounts to ethnic cleansing under some definitions. So I don't know if you were 100% literally correct that they agreed with the wording of they would support ethnic cleansing and genocide, but it sounds like they support the policy. They believe Arabs should be expelled or transferred from Israel.
I mean, once you're saying a group of people should be expelled, you're saying that they need to be ethnically cleansed. Because I mean, if we sat there and said, Black Americans, they need to go back to Africa, let's just all uproot them and transfer them to any African country, that's pretty clear that you're expelling them, you're ethnically cleansing.
And I mean, before Hitler kind of settled on the Holocaust, one of the options they were thinking about was putting all of the Jews somewhere else. Yeah. I think they thought about Madagascar. Like that was something that they wanted to do before they decided on the final solution.
Yeah, it's anytime you have a people who are unwanted and you have anyone entertaining the idea of, hey, let's all uproot them. Well, what do you think is going to happen when those people who they want to uproot and transfer away decide that they decide, well, we don't want to deal with them. We want to get rid of them. And that population says, no, we're going to fight. Then it's all right, round them up and kill them. If they don't want to go peacefully.
Currently in
it
Gaza
hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened, but I could see it in a long, if you go too far with this and the population just sours and sours and sours, because there's a reality. Israel does not want they do not want the Palestinians. It is as Elizabeth Warren said, it is viewed as a demographic time bomb. I mean, that's an unfortunate thing to say because, it shows what happens when you just uncritically allow a country to get away with everything. Okay, it's uncritical. It's let these people do, what they want, and we will back them no matter what. Well,
how much do we back them? Do you know any of the stats around that? Like, how much worth of arms do we give them?
Somewhere around 3.3 billion to 3.8 billion in arms
per year.
Plus, there's also like during this crisis, they greenlit an extra $710 million of arms to be sold to them. So this is how they work. Yeah. So Israel's the IDF is really interesting, and if you look at it, they have their own weapons until you get into the Air Force and all that stuff. Israel is not allowed to make anything that competes with the American weapons industry. Nothing. They make add-ons for like airplanes and all that. They'll make weapon systems designed to complement American stuff, but they don't make any competitors.
Does Israel have nuclear weapons?
It's said they do, but they deny it.
Okay.
It's unofficial. They're not signatory. I remember correctly. They're not a signatory to that. They're also not a signatory to the ICC. If you take them to the International Criminal Court, they'll just ignore it, and they'll use the United States to say no.
Okay.
Or really, United States will just say no.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But United States would do that for anyone. So I want people to make it very clear. Gideon Levy and many of them say that at times it looks like Israel controls America. No. America lets its allies from Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they let any of their allies do whatever they want as long as it doesn't affect their interest. United States doesn't give a crap about what the Israelis do to the Palestinians, just like they didn't care about what the Saudis and the UAE did to Yemen. Yemen right now is having one of the worst crises.
We backed them as well.
Yeah.
They were dropping American bombs, I believe.
Yes. We sold tons of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and they took all that and they dropped it on a lot of poor people's head, because Yemen is the poorest Arab country in the region. My dad likes to say that a lot. He's like, the poorest Arab country in the region, people who will never leave their area. He's like, they're getting bombed. Isn't that something? It really ticks him off. But it's a sad thing to see that. So it's like, it's not just, Israel doesn't get special treatment, I would say. The treatment is really consistent with all American allies. It's just so many countries are also willing to look the other way, Europe and all that. Like the rhetoric is always just hollow. Mm-hmm. They may say something about they may say something, but it doesn't mean nothing.
Yeah, that's another thing that we should talk about, the narrative in the West about this story. But also I wanted to say that, because we were talking a bit about what do Israelis think of this? I mean, what does the average Israeli think? So 40% agreed that they would want all Arabs to be expelled. But not everybody is going to think that way. I mean, here on amnesty.org, it says that in 2020, at least 4 Israeli conscientious objectors to military service were imprisoned. Hillel Rabin spent 56 days in military prison for refusing to serve in the Israeli army, citing oppressive policies against Palestinians. And of course, every Israeli has to serve in the military. So, there are going to be people who speak out against it. There always are, but
there's Breaking the Silence. Mm-hmm. People should go to that. Breaking the Silence was an Israeli peace activist organization that during Operation Protective Edge, they went and talked to the soldiers. They wanted to know what happened in Operation Protective Edge. And so they decided who's best to talk to than the Israeli soldiers. And the Israeli soldiers give some really, like, you have some where the guys were like, I don't know how I feel about I saw. And then you had others where like, it was like a video game. We were just bombing the crap out of them. It was so cool. There's videos people should see right now on YouTube. Killing Gaza is up by Max Blumenthal. And there's one point where they go to this Palestinian town where the IDF, these are just farmers, okay? There were no fighters. They were just farmers, okay? The IDF is there. They go and they put all these explosives under a mosque and blew it to smithereens, just completely annihilated it. And then they proceed to still bomb this place. And the people living there, when they were talking to them, they're like, we're farmers. There's no Hamas in this area. They're like, there was no reason to do this. Well, they had the video of a tanker sitting, like the tankers that they were gonna blow up the mosque. They showed the mosque's destruction by the Israeli point of view. So you could hear them laughing and giggling over its destruction, being like, yeah, this is what they get, serves them, you know? And
It
it's like,
reminds me so much of what we have seen with American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the way
yeah,
that they dehumanize the enemy and that they take pleasure from killing. They see it like a video game. Obviously, not everyone is like this, but it's a result of the dehumanization that you have to do. I mean, when your job is to kill someone,
yeah,
you dehumanize them in order to do it. And
yeah.
that's something we always see in war. It really reminds me of that, some of those leaked videos of Americans that we saw from WikiLeaks and whatnot, where they're
Well,
bombing people,
take into
doing drone
account,
strikes rather.
yeah, take into account what the Israelis, 25% of the Israeli military, they select them from school. Out of school, you go into the IDF. Well, the ones that kind of have an issue, like with going into the IDF and all that, they will take them on what they call the March of the Living, where they take them to Auschwitz, they take them to the Majdanek concentration camp, and they make them see this, and they tell these kids, this is what you're fighting for. This is what you're fighting to keep from happening. This is what you have. Everyone outside of Israel is a threat, and the people that are that we occupy want to do this to you. So they're indoctrinating a portion of their military that will go in and sit there and say, all right, we have a right to do so horrible things. And the Israeli military has been saying that they're having a harder and harder time controlling their soldiers. The soldiers are not listening to their officers like they should. The reason for this comes down to you have to look at it. An occupation really degrades the way soldiers are. It degrades, it doesn't help. Like, that's why I was saying to occupy a country or occupy a people degrades your military. One, they get used to fighting people they can beat. Two, they get lazy. The morale changes because it's an unending conflict that continues to go, and it just makes them more it makes them crazy. And that's why you have some of these soldiers doing what they do and enjoying it, because it's just when you indoctrinate the soldiers and then they have to do this occupation, they're garrisoning them. Then eventually, they're going to come across people who don't like them and they don't like them. So, it creates more strife and more problems, and your military degrades and degrades and degrades. And how strong the Israeli military is. Well, back in 2007, that stalemate in Lebanon really was a defeat. That was the reason why Operation Cast Lead was launched. They admitted it. They said we have to restore our deterrence factor, and this is a part. Operation Cast Lead is a part of restoring our deterrence factor for what happened in Lebanon, because in Lebanon, Hezbollah and the militias that were united to them, they gave Israel a whooping on the ground, and that was never seen before. The mighty Israeli military getting pushed back by a bunch of militias. So that really shook the Israelis, who immediately took it out on the Gazans by Operation Cast Lead. And it also shows an occupation really destroys the military. It degrades their fighting capacity.
Can we go back to what you were saying before about the ICC?
Yes.
Because
Are you
can you
seeing?
explain? Yeah. So here, Norman Finkelstein was interviewed by the Gray Zone about this, and It says here, in a landmark ruling, the International Criminal Court has ruled that it has jurisdiction to investigate Israel for war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territories. However, scholar and author Norman Finkelstein warns that the ICC decision, while historic, is unlikely to deliver justice.
Mhm.
According to Finkelstein, the Palestinian Authority's capitulation in the Oslo Accords gives Israel room to flout the court's jurisdiction. Meanwhile, the reality of Israel today, what the Israeli group B'Tselem recently called a regime of Jewish supremacy, undermines any notion of a separate Palestinian state.
So what happens is if you notice, the United States is kind of like the world's police. It has the ability to enforce UN law and whatnot. The reason why it can do that is that most of the countries, this goes into the petrodollar and all that, most countries have to use the American dollar to do trade. So the United States can immediately just tell those nations, we're not letting you use our dollar, which is what they do to Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. When the United States doesn't let a nation use their dollar for trade, it means that that nation can't get access to goods and services from Europe or United States. They have to go to someone like China, which is why China is rising. Because right now, any nation that's aligned with the United States can really buck the system, and Israel bucks it because take them to the ICC. United States is the one that's going to have to enforce that. The rest of the countries can say, well, we're not going to trade with Israel. Well, as long as Europe trades with Israel and as long as the United States trades with Israel, they're untouchable. They can flout everything. So that's why they simply can. They can ignore everything. It's like they don't have to fear the UN, because whatever the UN says is either going to be symbolic or it's going to be vetoed by the US if it's actually got teeth. So Israel, just like Turkey, just like Saudi Arabia, just like UAE, they can flaunt the rules. That is the specialty of a country that is the United States, is a cornerstone of United States interest. And that's what Israel is.
And by the way, I asked you before when it was that Israel withdrew the forces from Gaza, and here on B'Tselem it says in 2005 Israel withdrew the forces from the Gaza Strip. But then in 2007, after Hamas took over, that's when Israel imposed the blockade. That's still in place.
Well, they still never when they withdrew, they didn't take the soldiers and just remove them. They did exactly that. They built their bases around. What happened here is the blockade, then they just made everything solid. So beforehand, 2005, 2006, Gazans could go and work in Israel, because that's what happens. A lot of the West Bank and Gaza, they will work in Israel proper and come back to the occupied territories. So that's why people say it's an apartheid, because like the Bantustans, the South African blacks would live in the Bantustans, come out and work in white South Africa. That's why they draw that comparison. The problem with it is that Israel does not give two craps about having Palestinian labor. They have it, but they don't need it. They don't want it. They'd much rather have settlers and all that do that stuff.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, and I mean, so speaking of this whole question of whether this is apartheid, you had B'Tselem, which is this really large Israeli human rights organization, and they've come out and said that it's apartheid. They released this statement and said, more than 14 million people, roughly half of them Jews and the other half Palestinians, live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea under a single rule. The common perception is that the two separate regimes operate side by side, but they say one regime inside the borders of the sovereign state of Israel is a permanent democracy with a population of about 9 million, all Israeli citizens. The other regime in the territories Israel took over in 1967, whose final status is supposed to be determined in future negotiations, is a temporary military occupation imposed on some 5 million Palestinian subjects.
Yeah, temporary.
Mm-hmm.
Seems pretty permanent.
Yeah, indefinite.
Indefinite, yes. I mean, if they don't, I mean, think about what Israel's in right now. I mean, if the Likud is preventing the two-state solution, that means you either have the one-state solution or you just have indefinite occupation. Because the reality is the two-state solution is not tenable.
Why do you think so?
Because there's too many settlements. There's too many settlements and there's too many roads. Okay, Israel has built up this, like, if you look at the map of the West Bank, first things first, you're going to see this massive separation wall that spans much of the border between that and Israel, like the occupied territories borders and all that. Then you have on the other side this massive amount of Israeli controlled space. They control that. That's the part where Jordan's borders is with the with West Bank. The Israelis are on that side. Then when you look at every town, every village of the Palestinians, they're all ringed by settlements. Like, that is just how it's built. You think they're going to build all these roads, these highways, these things that crisscross and basically chop up the West Bank so that a town that would take 5 minutes to get to now takes about an hour for the Palestinians? You think they're going to give that all up? It's untenable. They're not going to give it up. They don't even want to remove the settlers. And I think Ali Abunimah put it best when he said that in these, what is the point of negotiations? It's like negotiating for a pizza while the person is eating it in front of you. What, the longer it goes, what do you have left? And I mean, you see it if you look at the map. Like New York Times, they did an op-ed by Daniel, I think it's Dana Buta. The article shows just what is left of the West Bank, and it literally is like a bunch of cantons. That's all it is.
It's
massive separate cantons.
What is that?
Like Bantustans. It's just pockets of Palestinian controlled areas. Take say Los Angeles, or say take California. Imagine somebody takes Los Angeles and then builds settlements all around the city and then makes all the roads outside of it, okay, crisscrosses all the roads so that all of the normal roads can no longer be used, and there's checkpoints on all that, and now you have all this territory outside of Los Angeles that's basically has a spider web over top of it. So the people in Los Angeles, if they want to go somewhere, they got to go all over and avoid the Jewish controlled areas. Or in this case, in this people, it could be Chinese, the Chinese controlled areas.
Careful.
And that's what the Palestinians have. I mean, unless Israel is willing to go back to the 1967 borders, which is what the Palestinians are willing to argue for, they're not even willing to argue for the 1948 borders. Not for what the UN was originally giving them. They're willing to say, you can have all that. We'll take the 67 borders. That's not enough. Okay, Elon Papi, no, not Elon Papi.
While you're looking for that, I'll just say that Norman Finkelstein said, the Palestinians are not asking for the sun, the moon, and the stars. They're asking for their basic human rights. And I think that's kind of illustrated in what you're saying right now. And also, according to Norman Finkelstein, the Likud party has sabotaged attempts to actually do a two-state solution.
Yeah, the Israelis could do it. I mean, when they won in 1967, the Arabs were willing to give them all the rest of what they had. Just go back to the Palestinians were willing to take 30% of what they were willing to give them. Okay, originally. 30% of the land. Israel said no. That's it. From then on, it has always been an all or nothing. And what can you do in that case? Like what can you do when dealing with that situation? When you have a party that says, no, it will not go. We will not have this, we will not give a single inch of land to the Palestinians. And you get these, like, people sit there and say the Oslo Accords. Okay, the Oslo Accords was not about giving land. It was about creating the PLO. It was about turning the PLO into a colonial style government that would administer to the Palestinians. That is all of what the Palestinian Authority is. It is nothing more than that. And you go from that to what is it? The Camp David, when Ehud Barak offered them basically the settlements and all that. They didn't offer the settlement. They offered them the land. The settlements would all stay. Okay. The roads would stay Israel. Everything would stay Israel's. The only thing they were offered was a bit of their land, and everything would still be under control of Israel. The Palestinians balked at that. They said that's nothing changes that. And the Israelis were like, well, you'll leave here and we'll say that you're the bad guy. And America and all that said, well, they're the bad guy. They won't, we made the most generous offer. That was worse than what was done after 1967. And from there, what do you get? You get the Likud party coming in and saying there will never be a two-state solution. We will make sure that never happens. And has the two-state solution happened? No. And I don't think, I am a pessimist. I don't think it ever will happen.
Yeah. And so now there's been a ceasefire as of last week, I think. So sort of late May, there was a ceasefire between Hamas and the Israeli government.
Yes.
What do you think we will expect to see going forward?
Well, we're already seeing crackdowns. So the evictions are still going. So they're still doing that. They're still now they're just going around arresting people en masse and promising if Hamas breaks the ceasefire that they'll come down harder on Gaza. So, and we know that Israel was not happy about having to do this ceasefire. Okay, all of the information coming out of Israel is that Israel is not happy about it. They see it as a form of defeat, and they're kind of champing at the bit to go back at them. So I would say that the thing that you have to worry about is Israel starting to provoke, because Israel can, and this has been proven, Israel can go and say, we have a ceasefire, and immediately assassinate somebody via a missile strike, and then say, well, we didn't break the ceasefire. Once Hamas starts firing back, they say, Hamas broke the ceasefire. We just assassinated somebody who had to be taken out. That wasn't breaking the truce. And the world says, yes, you're right. So that's the situation you're dealing with. So,
and then in terms of the international, public opinion starting to shift a little bit more. It's becoming more mainstream to criticize Israel.
Now, Israel does have a fear that they should have, in that Benjamin Netanyahu has really made an enemy of the Democratic populace. Okay, people who are aligned with the Democratic Party seem not to be too happy with this guy who plays the Republican Party against their president and Obama, and will potentially say things to Biden as well. So he has been very chummy with Trump.
Yeah,
Which
and I
when you
mean the
have,
Kushners, right? He's like personal
yeah,
family friends with the Kushners.
yeah. And so right now you have this feeling amongst many Democrats that Israel has become a partisan issue. They're a Republican Party thing. And American politics is very Manichaean and very divided. So they're going to look at it and be like, okay, well, why don't we go the opposite route? If the Republicans are all for this, we should go all against it. So that contrarian nature of American politics, especially now after Trump, really means that the Democratic Party could potentially become harder to the Israelis. Under Biden, I don't think it will happen. Biden is one of the biggest Israeli supporters there is. But in future administrations, if the Democrats can maintain power, that can change.
I think you're right
Republican,
that it's become something that you follow your group on, the package of the Democrats. I mean, there was
yeah.
kind of a meme or a joke or something about people with BLM in their bios are waiting to see what their opinion should be on Israel.
Well, think about this from the Arab perspective, the Arab American perspective. Like many Arab Americans are socially conservative, but they vote for the Democrats because the Republican Party basically threw them out. Okay, the Republican Party has basically been like one of the most anti-Muslim parties of America, and so the thing for Arab America is you're either backing this LGBTQ crazy party that is pushing for trans women or women sort of things, which is a non-starter for most Muslims and most American Muslims at that. But you don't have a Republican Party to go to because on that side they don't even want you. So that means that you've got to go to the Democrats because they're the only party that you have just an inkling of pro-Palestinian support. So it's like you're cut off at the knees before you even get to do anything. Yeah. Like it's such a crappy situation.
But us. I mean, to be honest, though, Democrats, Republicans, those things are just shallow, aren't they? They're really the same party. I mean,
yes, it is, but you have to understand something. Like there is a problem with it in that while they are the same party, like the Democrats will surveil Arab Muslims in America. They will surveil just like the Republicans. The rhetoric is kinder. Okay, the rhetoric is kinder. Mm-hmm. So you kind of like, do you go with the hand that is going to slap you, or do you go with the hand that's going to punch you? It's kind of like that's the thing. One's going to hit you. Which one do you want to take? Because you know where the Republicans are. At least you know that. But the Democrats at least have a bit of kindness there, even if it is
the poison kindness.
Yes, it's so terrible. Like it really is. Like I don't know. It's just something that it really cheeses me in that way. I mean, to see that, like, you're voting against yourself no matter what. That's the feeling. You're voting against yourself no matter what.
I mean, you could say that from many groups' perspectives, right? Anyone who's working class, anyone, really everyone, we have to vote against our own interests. Because, I mean, unless you're like me and you just vote for the Green Party, but there's no point to that, really.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like, you're totally right on that. You're just voting for. Why are you voting at all? I think my dad is right when he sits there and says, there's no reason to vote. They're the guy they want's going to get in anyway. So just let everyone make their decision and just keep on going. It's going to happen no matter what. And it seems like that's the course. That's all I've been saying for the last like 10 years. That's the one thing that I always have to concede to him when we do argue, is that has anything changed? No.
Right. So I think that brings us to the end of our episode about Israel and Palestine. I mean, obviously, we just kind of brushed the surface a little bit, but you guys can catch us here on this channel every other Wednesday. We have new episodes of The Underground, and let us know if there's a specific topic that you want us to cover. We're going to keep looking at other geopolitical and cultural issues from our alternative perspective.